Well, good morning everyone. My name is Jim Manson and I'm editor of naturalproductsglobal.com, which is the news website that forms part of Diversified's organic, natural and eco portfolio. Diversified being the organiser of the two events here in Malmo. And what I want to do this morning over the next 15 minutes or so is to share some ideas and some thinking that I set out in a couple of blog posts that I wrote for NPG earlier this year. The first of these was titled "Don't Keep Calm: Why we need to rediscover our rebellious past," and the other ran under the headline "Use in Emergency: Why we need to remake the case for organic in a climate crisis," and that's the title that I borrowed for this morning's talk. Both these blog posts share some overlapping themes and ideas, but they also contain some warnings for the organic sector. I'm going to come back to that. But I want to start with a statistic that I think should make us all sit up. And it's not this one. So here we see organic edges towards $100 billion milestone. And I wanted to show this headline, this statistic, because it's just one of the many ways that our industry and our movement can show that organic is a remarkable success story, particularly in the way we've built up this enormous global market. $100 billion is a lot of money by pretty much any measure. But the figure that I find myself coming back to is this one. Organic accounts for 1.4% of productive farmland globally, and that figure comes from the World of Organic Agriculture 2019 report, published jointly by IFOAM and FIBEL in Germany. 1.4%, a figure described as paltry. Not by me, but by IFOAM, the International Organic Organisation, and, as I mentioned, co-authors of the very same report. Now, if you were one of those people who likes to criticise organic, you would probably be saying, why are we even talking about organic, looking at that figure? You'd be saying that organic is a statistical irrelevance. And even if you weren't that organic skeptic character, let's say instead you were a food policy specialist at the WHO, you might still be thinking, can we really afford to wait for organic to catch up? And I think you'd probably have a point. Now, lots of us, and many of you today in this room, got into organic because, hands up, we wanted to change the world. We wanted to spread the word about the benefits of farming with the grain of nature, and we wanted to make organic available to everyone. IFOAM EU has a stated aim to see organic on every table. And I think that if we are really serious about that being part of our mission, then we too should share some of the frustration about still being stuck at 1.4%. And that's where I want to go next. In October last year, a group of the world's leading climate scientists warned that there was just 12 years left to prevent an irrevocable climate catastrophe. And if you want to know what that would look like, I'd strongly suggest taking a read of David Wallace Wells's essay, The Uninhabitable Earth, whose famous first line reads, "I promise you, it's far worse than you think." And this event, this declaration, I think, fired the starting gun of a new phase of environmental activism. In Sweden, Greta Thunberg with a school strike for the planet. A few months later, Extinction Rebellion, founded in the UK initially, quickly sweeping up supporters across the planet to demand that governments tell the truth about the climate crisis. And these campaigns have fast-tracked public awareness of the consequences of runaway global heating. The vocabulary of climate change itself is more urgent. Global warming has been redesignated global heating. Climate change has become the climate crisis. And by August of this year, 935 jurisdictions in 18 countries had declared a climate emergency. More evidence of just how quickly the climate crisis and climate debate is moving. One of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, as we know, is agriculture, producing as much as a third of total emissions. So the question of how we should farm and how we should utilise land more generally has taken on a whole new level of importance. Now, in August of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, published a landmark report, all 1,300 pages of it, on this very subject, called the Climate Change and Land Report. And that brings me back to organic. Organic farming's multiple climate change mitigation benefits are well established, well documented, more efficient at carbon sequestrations and locking carbon into the soil, lower nitrous oxide emissions with their 300 times more potent warming impact than CO2, and lower overall energy use, just to name three. Yet in the 40-page summary for policymakers of the IPCC reports, and that's the version that gets seen by the media and politicians, organic agriculture gets just a single specific reference. And I think that solitary reference to organic farming among a list of generic agroecological approaches should sound a warning to the sector, because increasingly organic is being bundled with a range of, in inverted commas, sustainable practices. So we hear about nature-based solutions, sustainable intensification, big buzzword, climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture, integrated farming, and so on. And the impression that's created is that all of these have some kind of rough equivalency. And yet some of these are untested, unsubstantiated, and frankly little more than ecological wishful thinking. Organic farming, with several decades of development, scientific research and market building behind it in its modern form and origins going back to the 1920s, ought to be the benchmark for sustainable agriculture and the favoured model for policymakers. But often it isn't. So why is that? Here's what the Dutch organic advocate Ronald van Marlen has to say. Van Marlen says that in international policy circles there is an increasing avoidance of the O word, O for organic. Instead, he says, what we hear are all the alternative words, the alternative discourses, almost anything but organic, he says. And it's not just on the policy making front that organic will have to compete harder to make its voice heard. Climate anxious consumers want the food choices they make to align with the approaches they think offer the most effective solutions. And these new consumer priorities are already feeding through to the market, beginning to see that. And the dramatic growth of the plant-based food and vegan categories is in part a response to the remarkable cut-through of the eat less meat message from climate campaigners and expert groups like the IPCC. And judging from all the headlines, eat less meat was the big take-home from the IPCC report. Much less about the need to farm differently and barely, as I said and mentioned, of organic at all. Now you might be thinking, well, hang on, I've been reading in Natural Products Global over the last 3 years about how the organic market has been growing strongly around the world in recent years and seeing double-digit growth here in Europe. And yes, that's all true. But take a look at this, because I think it's relevant to this discussion. When the extraordinary growth rates that we've seen in Sweden's organic market slowed dramatically to 4% in 2018, from 20 to 40% between 2015 and 2017, the specialist organic consultancy EcoWeb suggested that it was in part the result of the retail industry shifting its focus away from organic to other ethical labels and value propositions in response to those changing consumer priorities. So we see plant-based, vegan, local, Swedish being the winners in 2018 as shoppers placed their votes at the checkout. And one of the striking features of the rise of veganism in the UK, up 260% in 10 years, is the way the vegan movement has commanded, almost demanded, the attention of consumers and the media. A really energised campaigning style has perfectly caught the mood of the time and helped recruit swathes of new followers. And what's really interesting about vegan messaging in 2019 is that it is often about driving cultural change, and it's unafraid to engage politically and on issues of justice, welfare and fairness. And by contrast, organic messaging, which has borrowed heavily in recent years on the language of mainstream food industry marketing, precisely to make it appeal to a more mainstream audience, so that's understandable, suddenly sounds out of step with the urgency of the task in hand. Now think about that, because it's in such stark contrast to where we've come from. Our industry has always been instinctively unorthodox. The natural food movement emerged directly from 1960s counterculture. The earliest manifestations of the vegetarian movement were founded on some quite radical thinking, both nutritionally and politically. Many vegetarian women in the Victorian era identified as feminists, for example. And later, the fair trade movement helped transform the lives of farmers and growers in developing countries and expose the exploitative practices of powerful food industry conglomerates. But as these ideas have been repackaged for a mainstream audience, as marketing imperatives have replaced campaigning priorities, we seem to be taking the advice of the big brand agencies who we now pay to advise us at face value by normalising organic. Just at the very moment that other movements and causes are toughening up their messaging, organic risks diminishing its points of difference and losing its voice. The climate crisis is a massive challenge for society. It also provides an opportunity for organic decisively to demonstrate its continuing relevance. And it needs to. Remember that 1.4% figure, organic's share of total farmland. Climate change is not and should not be the primary objective of organic farming, but the global context in which organic exists is changing fast, and there can be little doubt that disruption to the planet's climate will dominate global affairs in the coming years and decades. So how do we move organic to the heart of future food and farming policy making? First, I think we do need now to remake the case for organic in a climate crisis. We have to show convincingly that organic agriculture is a proven whole system approach that delivers both on greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, but also the wider social and equality goals that are called for by the IPCC and Planetary Health Diet reports. Now, I want to finish on a positive note and end with a couple of examples of what I see as this type of thinking in action. So here are some brands here in Scandinavia and over in the US who are disrupting and pressing the case for organic. On the left, you can see some recent hard-hitting, provocative campaigns on pesticides from Coop in Sweden and Denmark. And on the right, a campaign by Stonyfield Organic that encouraged school children to think about and get involved with the GMO debate. These are risk-taking campaigns and they need to be deployed strategically, but importantly they are unafraid to say what they and organic stands for, even if that sometimes means saying what organic is against. And finally, to these leaders of 14 global cities from Copenhagen to London, Los Angeles to Tokyo, global leaders who are using the O word and offering solidarity to our movement. In their Good Food Cities Declaration, they say that food procurement policies should be aligned to the Planetary Health Diet and, quote, ideally sourced from organic agriculture. And that gives us, I think, a glimpse of what is possible, what enormous opportunities there are to be grasped for people and planet, if we can show that we are ready to inspire the next generation of conscious citizens. The planet has been placed on an emergency footing. Organic must be mission ready. Thank you very much for listening.